Four Arthurian Romances by Chertin de Troyes. This is a public domain book. Originally written in Old French sometime in the second half of the 12th century AD by the court poet Chertin de Troyes. Introduction. Chertin de Troyes has had the peculiar fortune of becoming the best known of the old French poets to students of medieval literature, and of remaining practically unknown to anyone else. The acquaintance of students with the work of Chertin has been made possible in academic circles by the admirable critical editions of his romances undertaken and carried to completion during the past 30 years by Professor Wendelin Forster of Bonn. At the same time, the want of public familiarity with Chertin's work is due to the almost complete lack of translation of his romances into the modern tongues. The man who, so far as we know, first recounted the romantic adventures of Arthur's knights, Gawain, Yvain, Eric, Lancelot, and Percival, has been forgotten, whereas posterity has been kinder to his debtors, Wolfram von Eschenbach, Malory, Lord Tennyson, and Richard Wagner. The present volume has grown out of the desire to place these romances of adventure before the reader of English in a prose version based directly upon the oldest form in which they exist. Such extravagant claims for Chertin's art have been made in some quarters that one feels disinclined to give them even an echo here. The modern reader may form his modem? The modem reader may form his own estimate of the poet's art, and that estimate will probably not be high. Monotony, lack of proportion, vain repetitions, insufficient motivation, wearisome subtleties, and threatened, if not actual, indelicacy are among the most salient defects which will arrest and mayhap confound the reader unfamiliar with medieval literary craft. No greater service can be performed by an editor in such a case than to prepare the reader to overlook these common faults, and to set before him the literary significance of this 12th century poet. Chertin de Troyes wrote in Champagne during the third quarter of the 12th century. Of his life we know neither the beginning nor the end, but we know that between 1160 and 1172 he lived, perhaps as herald at arms, according to Gaston Paris, based on Lancelot, 5591-94, at Troyes, where was the court of his patroness, the Countess Marie de Champagne. She was the daughter of Louis VII and of that famous Eleanor of Aquitaine, she is called in English histories, who, coming from the south of France in 1137, first to Paris and later to England, may have had some share in the introduction of those ideals of courtesy and woman service which were soon to become the cult of European society. The Countess Marie, possessing her royal mother's tastes and gifts, made of her court a social experiment station, where these provincial ideals of a perfect society were planted afresh in congenial soil. It appears from contemporary testimony that the authority of this celebrated feudal dame was weighty and widely felt. The old city of Troy, where she held her court, must be set down large in any map of literary history, for it was there that Sheridan was led to write 4 romances which together form the most complete expression we possess from a single author of the ideals of French chivalry. These romances, written in 8-syllable rhyming couplets, treat respectively of Eric and Enid, Clige, Yvain, and Lancelot. Another poem, Percival de Gaulois, was composed about 1175 for Philip, Count of Flanders, to whom Sheridan was attached during his last years. This last poem is not included in the present translation because of its extraordinary length, at 32,000 verses, because Sheridan wrote only the first 9,000 verses, and because Miss Jessie L. Weston has given us an English version of Wolfram's well-known Parzival, which tells substantially the same story, though in a different spirit. To have included this poem, of which he wrote less than 1/3, in the works of Sheridan, would have been unjust to him. It is true the romance of Lancelot was not completed by Sheridan, we are told, but the poem is his in such large part that one would be over-scrupulous not to call it his. The other 3 poems mentioned are his entire. In addition, there are quite generally assigned to the poet 2 insignificant lyrics, the pious romance Guillaume d'Angleterre, and the elaboration of an episode from Ovid's Metamorphose, called Philomena by its recent editor, C. Debord, Paris, 1909. All these are extant and accessible, but Guillaume d'Angleterre and Philomena are not universally attributed to Sheridan, and since they have nothing to do with the Arthurian material, it seems reasonable to limit the present enterprise to Eric and Enid, Clige, Yvain, and Lancelot. Professor Forster, basing his remark upon the best knowledge we possess of an obscure matter, has called Eric and Enid the oldest Arthurian romance extant. It is not possible to dispute this significant claim, but let us make it a little more intelligible. Scholarship has shown that from the early Middle Ages, popular tradition was rife in Britain and Brittany. The existence of these traditions common to the Brythonic peoples was called to the attention of the literary world by William of Malmesbury, Gesta Regum Anglorium, and Geoffrey of Monmouth, Historia Regum Britanniae, in their Latin histories about 1125 and 1137 respectively, and by the Anglo-Norman poet Wace immediately afterward. Scholars have waged war over the theories of transmission of the so-called Arthurian material during the centuries which elapsed between the time of the fabled chieftain's activity in 500 AD and his appearance as a great literary personage in the 12th century. Documents are lacking for the dark ages of popular tradition before the Norman conquest, and theorists may work their will. But Arthur and his knights, as we see them in the earliest French romances, have little in common with their Celtic prototypes, as we dimly catch sight of them in Irish, Welsh, and Breton legend. Sheridan belonged to a generation of French poets who rook over a great mass of Celtic folklore they imperfectly understood, and made of what, of course, it had never been before, the vehicle to carry a rich freight of chivalric customs and ideals. As an ideal of social conduct, the code of chivalry never touched the middle and lower classes, but it was the religion of the aristocracy and of the 12th century honnête homme. Never was literature in any age closer to the ideals of a social class. So true is this that it is difficult to determine whether social practices called forth the literature, or whether, as in the case of the 17th century pastoral romance in France, it is truer to say that the literature suggested to society its ideals. Be that as it may, it is proper to observe that the French romances of adventure portray late medieval aristocracy as it fain would be. For the glaring inconsistencies between the reality and the ideal, one may turn to the chronicles of the period. Yet even history tells of many an ugly sin rebuked, and of many a gallant deed performed because of the courteous ideals of chivalry. The debt of our own social code to this literature of courtesy and frequent self-sacrifice is perfectly manifest. What Chertien's immediate and specific source was for his romances is of deep interest to the student. Unfortunately, he has left us in doubt. He speaks the vaguest way of the materials he used. There is no evidence that he had any Celtic written source. We are thus thrown back upon Latin or French literary originals which are lost, or upon current continental lore going back to a Celtic source. This very difficult problem is as yet unsolved in the case of Chertien, as it is in the case of the Anglo-Norman Barrol, who wrote of Tristan about 1150. The material evidently was at hand, and Chertin appropriated it without much understanding of its primitive spirit, but appreciating it as a setting for the ideal society dreamed about but not realized in his own day. Add to this literary perspicacity a good foundation in classic fable, a modicum of ecclesiastical doctrine, a remarkable facility in phrase, figure, and rhyme, and we have the foundations for Chertien's art as we shall find it upon closer examination. A French narrative poet of the 12th century had three categories of subject matter from which to choose: legends connected with the history of France, matière de France; legends connected with Arthur and other Celtic heroes, matière de Bretagne; and stories culled from the history or mythology of Greece and Rome, current in Latin and French translations, matière de Rome la Grande. Chertien tells us in Clige that his first essays as a poet were the translations into French of certain parts of Ovid's most popular works, the Metamorphoses, the Ars Amoratia, and perhaps the Remedia Amoris, but he appears early to have chosen as his special field the stories of Celtic origin dealing with Arthur, the Round Table, and other features of Celtic folklore. Not only was he alive to the literary interest of this material when rationalized to suit the tastes of French readers, his is further the credit of having given to somewhat crude folklore that polish and elegance which is peculiarly French, and which is inseparably associated with the Arthurian legends in all modern literature. Though Barrol and perhaps other poets had previously based romantic poems upon individual Celtic heroes like Tristan, nevertheless to Chertin, so far as we can see, is due the considerable honor of having constituted Arthur's court as a literary center and rallying point for an innumerable company of knights and ladies engaged in a never-ending series of amorous adventures and dangerous quests. Rather than unqualifiedly attribute to Chertin this important literary convention, One should bear in mind that all his poems imply familiarity on the part of his readers with the heroes of the court of which he speaks. One would suppose that other stories, told before his versions, were current. Some critics would go so far as to maintain that Chertian came toward the close, rather than at the beginning, of a school of French writers of Arthurian romances. But if so, we do not possess these earlier versions, and for lack of rivals Chertian may be hailed as an innovator in the current schools of poetry. And now let us consider the faults which a modern reader will not be slow to detect in Chertian's style. Most of his salient faults are common to all medieval narrative literature. They may be ascribed to the extraordinary leisure of the class for whom it was composed, a class which was always ready to read an old story told again, and which would tolerate any description, however detailed. The pastimes of this class of readers were jousting, hunting, and making love. Hence the preponderance of these matters in the literature of its leisure hours. No detail of the joust or hunt was unfamiliar or unwelcome to these readers. No subtle arguments concerning the art of love were too abstruse to delight a generation steeped in amorous casuistry and allegories. And if some scenes seem to us indelicate, yet after comparison with other authors of his times, Sheridan must be left off with a light sentence. It is certain he intended to avoid what was indecent, as did the writers of narrative poetry in general. To appreciate fully the chaste treatment of Sheridan, one must know some other forms of medieval literature, such as the fabliaux, farces, and morality plays, in which courtesy imposed no restraint. For our poet's lack of sense of proportion, and for his carelessness in the proper motivation of many episodes, no apology can be made. He is not always guilty. Some episodes bespoke poetic mastery, but a poet acquainted as he was with some first-class Latin poetry, and who had made a business of his art, ought to have handled his material more intelligently, even in the 12th century. The emphasis is not always laid with discrimination, nor is his yarn always kept free of tangles in the spinning.